Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Mehdi Hashemi's presentation this morning. Before we start off, let me acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands in the Songhees, Squam, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. It's important to still realize in the virtual world during COVID that we are still very much on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples here in Victoria and Vancouver Island. And I think the university and the Center for Global Studies have a very strong role to play to address these past injustices and what it means to go forward. Let me introduce Mehdi Hashemi, who probably doesn't need much presentation here. But, you know, Mehdi, you might not have met all people in the hallways. It's a bit different this year. You know, we talked about this, you know, in our, circle in the admin meeting. It must have been a strange year, but I hope we can make at least, the sense of the center as real as possible in the virtual world. Like, hopefully, towards the end, we might have sessions in our building, but at the moment, you're very much part of this virtual community. So, Mehdi, is a student in the political science department in the doctoral program, and he works on a thesis that looks at the refugee crisis, quote unquote, and how the refugee experience has been depicted, created in discursive practices, both in the receiving countries, but also by the refugees themselves. And he came to UVic from Azad University in Tehran with an undergraduate degree in 2008, as you can see here, and joined UVic to do his MA that he completed in 2016. He is his research interests are in the field of international security and Islamic movements, thinking about radicalization in the Islamic world, but also looking at the plight of and the collective experience and politics of refugee issues in Europe, in the Western world, but also the sending countries. So Mehdi has also been quite active in the department. You know, he was involved in trying to make the university and the Department of Political Science more inclusive, looking at issues of equity. So he has been, beyond studying, he has filled various TA and RA positions. In addition to this, he has also been very strongly involved in the Iranian-Canadian community as a current president of the Victoria Iranian Person Cultural Society. So Mehdi, I'm very pleased to have you and present. I'm involved in your doctoral research as part of the committee, and I'm really excited about your project. I think we're going to hear a little bit about the heart of what you're doing with the pursuit of the unknown, titled Refugees in the Realm of Crisis. I think you will explain what this crisis means in quotation mark here. Mehdi, the floor is all yours, and you're very curious to hear where you're at and what you can already present about your doctoral research.
Thank you so much, Oliver. This is a great opportunity, and I'm thankful for being part of this amazing group, and thank you for being here. And I hope that at the end of my presentation, we can have a discussion, and I'm sure that there's a lot that I can learn from your comments and feedback. So the title of my project, Pursuit of the Unknown, Refugees in the Realm of Crisis. And this title actually was suggested with from one of my participants. Mehdi,
you're muted.
That would be a surprise if it didn't happen, actually. Thank you. Sorry, I was saying that this is the title of my project, and I'm thankful for it because it was suggested by one of my participants, my research participants. I'm going to navigate a couple of screens here. So this is the outline of my presentation. First, I'm gonna talk about the objective of this presentation, what I'm hoping to get out of this, and then some details of my research design, and then I'm gonna talk about my preliminary findings and some highlights, and then after that discussion. So I just finished basically transcribing I finished my interviews in October 2020, end of October, and since then I've been transcribing 44 interviews, and then for the past couple of weeks I've been trying to make sense of my data and trying to organize it and tidy it in a bit, and I managed to finish that just yesterday. So it's really fresh even for me. This is the earliest I could get this done, and I hope that you can help me at the end of this presentation to make sense of this data and how best I can proceed with my data, and how I can incorporate this data in my research, and what this information means, and what is the best way of using it. So the research problem, what motivated me is that, first of all, I used to work on international security, and I wrote my MA thesis on radicalization and foreign fighter movements. But then I realized that for my PhD, I wanted to do something that was closer to my heart. And that's why I chose forced migration, so I could bring in my own lived experiences as an ex-refugee. So that's the personal motivation. But the problem that I noticed, and some of it goes back from the time that actually I was a refugee myself, is that in the recent years, the number of refugees has increased, and there are some groups that are commonly referred to as or associated with a sense of refugee crisis, and others who are not. And as I'm going to get into this, the notion of crisis later on, we'll see that the notion of crisis is heavily state-centric, and refugee stories are sort of neglected. And that's what I'm hoping to do. I'm hoping to provide a space to refugees and refugee stories. The question I have is that the main question for this research is that how do refugee crisis constructions impact refugee behaviors and experiences at different points during the journey? So the emphasis is more on the responses from refugees than the construction of refugee crisis itself. Basically, for this project, I have a comparative case study of Iranian and Syrian refugee populations. And the reason I picked these two groups is that the Iranians are not associated with refugee crisis, but Syrian refugees have been commonly referred to or associated with the refugee crisis. And basically, the method I used was interviews with refugees. I interviewed with 44 participants, and I'm going to give you details of that in a few minutes. This is the broad approach that I took, but for specific parts of my research, I also incorporated some other methods as well, and I'm going to discuss them as well. So first, let's talk about refugee crisis, and I put it in quotation marks because I realized that this is a problematic notion. And when I started, I was quite set with that binary between crisis refugees and non-crisis refugees. And the more and more that I dug into this, into literature, and during my interviews, I realized that it is far more complicated, and than that binary, and that definitely the term crisis in refugee crisis is problematic in a sense that we have the construction of the notion, and also we have lived experiences. We have the impact. So crisis means different things, probably for policymakers and for refugees on the ground, and that's why I want to be careful with the use of the term. So in the literature, usually when we're talking about crisis, and this is super super brief and simplified discussion on crisis and refugee crisis. And usually when we're talking about crisis, we're talking about something that is bad and not normal, something that is a breaking point in a patterned process of linearity. And it usually means that there is a need for decisive state intervention. So that's what usually comes to mind when we're talking about crisis. But refugee crisis, of course, it's associated with high numbers of refugees, but it's not all of it. And commonly, when we're talking about refugee crisis, we refer to the states and states' role in the broader picture, and that's why I talked about that notion of centrality of state in understanding of refugee crisis. It refers to unpreparedness, and in the case of the refugee crisis in Europe, it refers to EU and the member countries and the neighboring countries' unpreparedness to respond to a large flow of migrants on towards European borders. And Della Porta defines it as a perception that institutional structures and policies in place were unfit to address what was presented as an emergency. But I did not find this adequate, and I tried to explore some of the empirical evidence myself. So I looked at some of the statistics on UNHCR annual global reports from 2008 to 2018, and I wanted to know, I was interested to know, when was the notion of refugee crisis constructed, and if it relates to any of the evidence outside. And I looked at the total number of persons of concern, and what I noticed that it was in 2013 that there was a huge spike in the numbers, total numbers, not 2015 or 2016, when the refugee crisis was basically when refugee crisis gained popularity. The other factor that I looked at is the regions hosting refugees in that era. And again, as you can see, in 2013, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa, probably mostly the neighboring countries, we're talking about Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey for the most part. We can see that there's a spike in the numbers in 2013 in the region, but it is not until 2014, 15, and 16 that basically Europe is facing large numbers of refugees. So again, we can see that while the number of refugees increased in 2013, 2012, 2013, there is sort of a lag. And this is, by the way, the Iranian and Syrian refugees. You can see, again, the spike. While the Iranian refugees, the numbers were quite consistent. It's not as clear in this, and I should have divided it probably in two different graphs. But we can see that the spike is in 2012, but as we saw it, probably I can go back. We can see that 2013, and then the neighboring countries, they take the basically they're faced with that reality earlier, but in Europe it happens a bit later. And this is the number of arrivals to Europe. Again, we can see the arrivals spike in 2015, and again, there is a lag. This is after it has started in Syria. The conflict is started in Syria, and this is certainly after a few countries in the region were hosting refugees. And this is the number of migrant deaths in their journey to Europe, and we can see that 2014, 15, and 16, the numbers were really high. So this means that the problem was way closer to European borders. As part of my analysis of the notion of refugee crisis and how and then it was constructed, I examined 8 newspapers, 2 of them from the region, Zaman and Ash-Sharq al-Awsat, 2 from the States, and 1 from England, and I believe 3 from Canada. And it is interesting that when we look at the graph, so this is the total number of times refugee and crisis, the 2 words together, appeared in any news article in any of these newspapers. And as you can see, the spike is again in 2015, later 2014, 2015, and then 2016, not 2012, not 2013. I'm yet to get into how these newspapers, these articles portrayed refugee crisis, but in terms of timing, I think I have a clearer image of when it was portrayed and whether it was a response to the conflict in Syria and the large number of refugees caused by that conflict, or other factors such as arrival of refugees to European borders. So this is a part that I still need to get some work done, but and I have a quote here. This is what one of my participants who was resettled in Canada mentioned, and this is a pseudonym. And it says, "It breaks my heart when countries say these refugees should go to that country, those refugees should go to this country, as if we are like some goods that can be bought or sold." And this is sort of makes me reflect on the idea of quotas and how refugees were handled within European context and internationally. In terms of refugee behaviors, I looked at the literature. As you can see, probably most of them are quite dated, and I was struggling to find more recent works, and I would be really happy if you have any suggestions on that. But I looked at different theories, push and pull factors, and a list of other approaches that are present. And one that I picked for, I borrowed for my work loosely, was Keller's basically 9 stages of decision-making for refugees. And I thought sort of it would help me to nicely set out different stages for decision-making and try to understand how refugees basically behave within those stages. So with that background, I'm going to present my findings. Again, some of it, I'm reflecting with you on this because this is the earliest I could get them ready. And this is some information about my participants. 44 interviews, 23 Iranians and 21 Syrians, 17 female, 27 male interviews. And this is the breakdown. Initially, when I started, when I wrote my proposal and started this project, I was hoping to be able to do these interviews across different countries with larger group of refugees. But because of the financial restrictions and the realities of graduate life, I couldn't do that. So I focused on Canada. But what happened was, after several months of struggling to find participants in Canada, I eventually expanded my geographical reach. And I think it made sense because it helped me to have to be able to grab that bigger picture and have a better understanding of what is going on as I was talking with refugees under different circumstances, with different journeys and all that. So I interviewed 11 refugees in Canada, 3 in the United States, 5 in England, 3 in Germany, 10 in Lebanon, and 12 in Turkey. The last 2 are 2 transit countries or asylum countries for Iranian and Syrian refugees. And the rest are basically some of the popular destinations for refugees. And 5 of them lived in camps, and 21 of them lived in Turkey in the past, and 16 of them either lived or currently are living in Lebanon. And in terms of the cases that these refugees had, I had a wide range of reasons for their basically journeys and for their asylum. And then you can see that, and these are, by the way, these are not legal information. These are the items that were discussed or reported by my participants. So, for example, why most of Iranians had either religious or political persecution for their legal documents. Some of them reported socioeconomic reasons or other reasons as well. Moving on with some other information. So again, so this is more on the interviewees. 30 of them were registered with UNHCR. 14 of them were not, and they basically dealt with state immigration authorities. And in terms of the types of journeys, these are the terms that I'm using. I don't know how accurate they are, but so basically, 37 of them at some point, 37 of them were resettled. They lived in a transit or asylum country, and then either are still there or were resettled in different countries. 6 of them traveled on foot. And the reason the total is more than 44 is that some of them were in a country of transit or asylum, and then they decided they wanted to travel on foot. And 6 of them, they directly took a flight and traveled to, let's say, London or US or Canada, and then they applied for asylum in their destination. And one of them was quite a strange, or rather different, in a sense that lived in Turkey not as a refugee, and then went to US, applied for asylum there, but then realized didn't want to stay there, and then came to Canada and applied for asylum in Canada. So as you can see, already the image seems to be really messy and really outside of what the lines that are out there. And these are some of the, so basically for the next few slides, what you'll see is that my participants' answers to some of my questions, and you can see the total, you can see it divided by by the nationality. And so this is a question about the factors impacting the timing of their flee. So I asked them, what was the reason that you chose that specific time? And it appears that most of them cited force. They had no option, either it being the spread of conflicts, which was reported mostly by Syrians or exclusively by Syrians, or immediate fear of prosecution, mostly by Iranians. And they didn't seem to have option in terms of when they were going to leave and escape the country, basically. Only two of them mentioned that it was the right international or seasonal environment for migration, and I found it quite fascinating. And again, these are things that my participants reported themselves. The next one, I asked them, why did you choose the country that you chose? Why did you choose Turkey or Lebanon, for example? And most of them reported family or a sense of community ties, whether it being having their church there or church members there, or for many of the Iranians, or having a family member working or living in Lebanon for most of the Syrians. And both groups reported that it was the easiest for them to travel to either Lebanon or Turkey, and we can see that ease of travel was a big factor. I asked them whether they think it is possible for them to return to their country, and none of them said yes, and not even the ones that were already resettled, none of them mentioned that they think it is possible for them to go back to the country for different reasons. And again, this is what my participants responded. I have another quote here. Worse than the war itself was the feeling being a burden, feeling being humiliated for who you are, and hearing your kids being attacked and you get attacked just because you are in such a situation was very hard and very painful, and not being able to go back to your country and live with dignity was and still is very hard. So I thought that this is probably relevant to the notion of repatriation. And the fact that most of these people, especially in Syrian group, in the Syrian group, basically leaving Syria was the last option. And actually, several of them had to, were displaced internally before they decided to leave the country. So so I just want to emphasize that leaving the country, especially for Syrians, was not the first option, and it wasn't the easiest option. So the next set of basically questions that I asked them was around the possibility of staying in the country or in their country of asylum, staying Lebanon or Turkey, and most of them thought that it's not an option, or they weren't sure, and only a small number of them said that it is a possibility, and only, I think, I have a couple of screens, only one of them out of the 44 reported that they wanted to actually stay in that country, and actually they did, and they got the Turkish citizenship, and it was a Syrian participant. I asked them, what is your ideal destination? So if you had the choice to pick a country, what country would you pick? Even if you're in Canada, you could pick any country. And as you can see in these numbers, I don't know how clear they are because I realize the fonts are small, but most of them mentioned Canada or US, and several mentioned Germany. I think Germany was the third option for most of them, and some of them mentioned that they don't have any preference, especially Syrians. 5 of them mentioned that they don't even have any preference, and as long as they leave Lebanon, it's fine with them. And if you look at some of the countries on this list, it was a surprise for me. For some of them, so for example, Morocco was because one of my participants had his girlfriend there, or Iraqi Kurdistan. Probably you're familiar with the demographics in Syria. Probably you can guess that that could have been a participant with Kurdish background. I had one participant who mentioned Arab countries in the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia and Ireland and Austria. There are other countries. I asked them, why did they choose these countries? And the reason I asked these questions, I wanted to see to what extent their decisions were informed by the information they were getting in the media, to what extent they were aware of refugee crisis. And I didn't ask the direct question of refugee crisis until the end of the interviews. And these are some of the responses that I had. So again, family ties or community ties were the highest, better treatment, and social welfare and job opportunities were, and education. Many of my participants mentioned job opportunities and education, and I asked them, where did you get your information from? So did you talk to people? Did you follow the news? And I asked them a set of questions about media and then refugee crisis itself. I asked them if they had access to the media around the time that they wanted to leave the country, while they were in the country of, in their transit country or country of asylum, and while they're traveling on foot. And as you can see, an overwhelming majority of them mentioned that they had access to some sort of media throughout their journeys. And only 6 mentioned that they didn't have access to media during the time they wanted to leave. And that was mostly for Syrian refugees who had problems with power outage and lack of electricity in the region because of the situation they were dealing with. I asked them what were some of the sources of information they had, because I wanted to see if they were following the news and saying what was happening, and then before, and after the refugee crisis was being constructed in the media. And I noticed that social media and TV were the highest, and they had access to media before they left. I asked them if they, let's see, what is the next questions? And again, I asked some of them, for the ones that traveled on foot towards European borders, and they had access to some sort of they had access to information, to media as well, whether it be internet. Out of 6, 2 mentioned that they had access to internet. They mentioned that they would go to, in different cities, they would go to coffee houses and try to connect to the internet. All of them mentioned that they had access to smartphones, and word of mouth basically was an important one as well. So the point being that they were not isolated. So I think that's the key takeaway for me from those responses. And again, in country of asylum, a source of information, TV, internet, social media, phone calls, basically talking to relatives or friends in other countries. And internet was a major one. And as you can see, most of my participants had access to internet while they were in a transit country. I asked them if they followed the news throughout their journey, if they were interested to know what was going on, and I asked them anything related to refugees. Again, this is before I asked them, before I brought up the notion of refugee crisis. And 38 of them mentioned that, yes, they did follow the news. Only 4 Iranians mentioned it. And I think some of them have been in Turkey. They were in Turkey. And the reason they weren't following, my sense was that because they were so frustrated with the situation in Turkey, it was so long that they stopped following the news because it was just hurting. But as you can see, most of them, a large majority of them, were following the news and they're interested to know what was happening. And I asked them if any particular event or news they felt impacted them. And 28 reported that, yes, they felt that something impacted them. And 12 said it didn't impact them. Again, not much difference. I don't know what to do with the difference between the two populations yet, but the majority seem to feel that they were impacted by the things that were happening around them, by particular things that I have listed here. So, and these are the list of things that they brought up, not myself. Germany's open door policy, Istanbul airport bombing, Trump travel ban, Trudeau's welcoming policy, refugees being on the European borders, the term refugee crisis, they mentioned it, increase in number of refugees in Turkey in 2011, the death of Alan Kurdi, Turkish government taking over refugee cases from UNHCR after its closure, the ongoing conflict in Syria, Brexit, Beirut explosion, the coup in Turkey, coronavirus, and a few others mentioned other things that were sort of more local and not really with big impact. So as you can see, the coup was a big one in the responses. And if I'm not mistaken, it was mostly by Syrians. And the reason they felt they were impacted because they were emotionally worried and concerned that if the Erdogan regime is removed, because of his support for refugees, their situation is not going to be the same as it was before. They mentioned coronavirus. Again, most of these are the ones who were in Lebanon. They lost their jobs and they had concerns about their financial situation. As you can see, Germany's open door policy was one of the things that they mentioned. It was mostly Syrians. It was interesting to me. Iranians didn't mention that, and some of these are interesting. The Turkish government taking over was one of them, mostly Iranians, but some of the Syrians as well. And then I asked them if they heard the phrase refugee crisis, and 40 of them, for the other 44, and some of them didn't answer the question, and I couldn't really press sometimes to get my answers because of the sensitivity of the matter. But 40 of them reported that, 40 other 44 reported that they had heard the term refugee crisis. All Iranian refugees heard it, and a majority of Syrian refugees were familiar with the term as well. Only one mentioned that they didn't hear, and that was one participant who was living in countryside, and that was just one exception. And I asked them if they felt they were impacted by that, by refugee. I explained it for them that, you know, refugee crisis refers to the events that happened 2015, 2016, and and asked them if they felt that they were impacted by this. And a majority of them mentioned that, yes, they feel that they were impacted by that. 25 out of 44 mentioned that they were impacted. And only a handful mentioned that they felt they were not impacted. And for example, with a couple of them, they left Turkey prior to 2015. So that would make sense that they didn't feel they were impacted. And then I asked them how they felt they were impacted. And these are some of the responses. And I found this quite interesting. Basically, the highlight is that they felt that their asylum or the refugee process could have taken way shorter if those if the refugee crisis didn't happen. And here again, this is the interesting part, because here the construction and the realities are the line between them is blurred. For refugees, when refugee crisis is lack of resources mostly, and they felt that they were neglected. So that's what they perceived as refugee crisis. And as you can see, the delay and mental and emotional impact on them, the feeling of uncertainty, the feeling of being a burden, as you could see in that quote, and financial impact, I think it doesn't do justice. It should be more than two, because delay means staying longer in sort of in that situation, and I think delay equals financial impact. This is my understanding as an ex-refugee and as somebody who talked to these people. So they brought up, they just mentioned it explicitly, but I believe that the impact was, it should be at least 12 to 16. So these are some of the ways that they felt they were impacted. They felt that the UNHCR neglected them. And in case of Iranians, they felt that since UNHCR transferred the authority to Turkish government, they were being treated poorly by the Turkish government, especially because in the case of LGBTQ plus communities and Christian converts, because the Turkish society and government is quite conservative. And these are some of the examples of how refugee crisis impacted their decisions. I'm yet to dig more into this. I think it needs more time for me and more to explore the information I have. But these are some of the ways that they felt impacted, or they responded to refugee crisis. They tried to find alternative channels for resettlement. I had a few participants in Turkey who mentioned that now they're already looking for, they've already found private sponsors to come to Canada. Some of the Syrians in Lebanon already found WOSC or other channels for resettlement. Some of them decided to, I think 3 of them decided to, in response to the refugee crisis and hearing what was happening, 3 of them started to change their journey, and instead of staying in Lebanon, they started moving towards Europe. And some of them decided to change their country, and one of them was going to Germany, but they decided to try to find a new destination. So these are some of the ways that they were impacted, and some of the ways that they tried to respond to refugee crisis. These are some of my thoughts, not really fully formulated, but I'm going to share them with you. Anyways, both of them seem to mention that the timing of their flight was dictated by force. They had no option. Like, for example, a few of the Syrians mentioned that they left their home after their house was literally hit by a missile or a rocket, or after they got injured and or they lost a family member. In terms of differences between them when it comes to choosing the country of asylum, didn't find anything meaningful. Choosing of their ideal destinations, again, very similar. A couple of the Syrians mentioned religion, and the choice of ideal destination was quite interesting too for some of them. A majority of Syrians in Lebanon spoke of mistreatment by Lebanese authorities, and it's interesting that while a majority of Iranian refugees in Turkey spoke of mistreatments by Turkish authorities and the society, Syrians had a drastically different experience, and they felt they were super welcomed, and I found that fascinating. And the treatment of Syrians in Lebanon was fascinating for me because this opens up an opportunity for future research, but I found it very similar to the situation that Afghanistani people, refugees have had in Iran. Similar culture, similar language, even similar religion, historical ties and all that. And you expect that, you know, the host country, the host society should be a bit more welcoming, but it's the opposite. So I find so many similarities in two cases, and I think that would be a fascinating project to explore those two cases. Both of the groups felt that they were neglected, especially by the UNHCR. They felt nobody cares about them. But the thing is that some of the Iranians, and I at the time when I was in Turkey too, I had that concern, I had that feeling that the priority is being given to Syrians. And here comes the complexity of the situation. While Syrians are being portrayed or associated with the refugee crisis, the thing is that for Syrians, for Iranians, Syrians are taking a priority, but even within the Syrian population, we can see drastically different experiences. Within Iranian populations, we see drastic different experiences. We have people who fly from Tehran to London and apply for asylum there without any issues. And at the same time, I had a participant from Iran who traveled on foot for 3 months, going through different countries to finally get to London under extreme circumstances. Nearly all of them mentioned that they heard the phrase refugee crisis, and they felt they were impacted by that. And it seems that emotional and, in my opinion, financial pressures and the delay seems to be the highlight of the impact of refugee crisis on refugees. And in terms of their responses, their behaviors, a changing of journey type, I missed it here, changing of the type of the journey or destination or resettlement channel, I think those three stood out to me as the most significant ways that they responded to the situation at the time. I have this final quote. It says, "We just felt that we are too much for Lebanon and Lebanese people. Like Lebanese people and Lebanon cannot handle all of Syrians, and we should find a place to get out of their land." So that emotional element really stood out for me, and it's pressure because I need your help to give me feedback as to how I can be appropriately using all this information. And this is, by the way, it might be 50% of the information I have collected, and this is what I thought was most relevant. But I have a lot more that I need to find a way to rightfully put out there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to hear your feedbacks and questions.
Thank you, Mehdi. It's exciting to hear, how your data collection comes together, and to see how you can actually substantiate your interpretations, and you come up with hypotheses. So I'm really pleased to see that clearly with COVID and all the challenges in approaching refugees, having done work in a similar field, I realize this is a population that often doesn't trust anyone, from official institutions, places of power, as much as universities are places of power, but the perception often is like this. So very well done. And also, you started off with your reflection of how refugees are often seen as objects. And I think your research, in a way, takes serious the idea that clearly it's not only these refugees, as much as they are constrained in their options, it's not only a matter of being moved around from one place to another, but they are active agents in decision making. They have agencies on their own, and it's interesting to see how and through what processes do they make decisions. Do they react in particular ways, not only as a kind of amorphous mass of people that are moved around, but really individuals making decisions based on particular information and a particular context. All right, with this, I would like to open it up. Who would like to go first? You can either simply start your camera or let me know in the chat, or raise a hand, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Martin, hi there.
Hello, hi Mehdi, hi Oliver, hi, hello everybody. Thank you so much for this, Mehdi. Fascinating, and as I'd echo Oliver's comments about just how important this is in terms of gaining the voice of the refugees. My question comes back to the title, Pursuit of the Unknown. And I raise it because something quite similar, terms that were quite similar were raised last week with Nicole's presentation by Michelle Lee Moore, this idea that that there's this pursuit of the unknown, and how do you capture the unknown in data analysis? And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. I mean, I think, to what extent was this reference to the pursuit of the unknown your pursuit? And in that in that sense, what is the unknown here?
So thank you so much, Martin. And it feels amazing because it feels like a semi-defense, because both Martin and Oliver are in my committee. And before responding to Martin's question, I want to, or first I'm going to respond to Martin's question, and then I'm going to reflect on what Oliver said earlier. And so it's hard to answer that question, the question of uncertainty. And this question of uncertainty comes from the experiences of refugees themselves. And this is when I ask one of my participants to describe your story, how would you find a title for your story that I can use for my project? And that uncertainty or that unknown comes from the fact that if we take that force as, because most of these participants, they reported that they had to leave the country, they were forced to, either fear of prosecution or bombing or ISIS or Assad or whichever direction the force was coming, they had to just leave. And as much as they try to have, well, they are active agents, as Oliver said, but there are so many limitations, and they are trying to find their way out of that situation. Some of them try to go to university, some of them try to go to Europe, some of them try to find different ways, some of them even change their cases. I had participants who were initially political refugees from Iran, and then they changed it to religious refugees who were converts. So, but the unknown is that while they try to make a change, knowing that where you're going to end up, I think that's something that has stood out for them, that it's hard for them to know where they're going to end up at the end of all of this.
Oliver, can I have a quick follow-up here? Okay, I'll try to make this brief because I see a number of other questions coming. But so I have to apologize because I wondered if to what extent that phrase "pursuit of the unknown" was descriptive of you and this thesis. But sorry for that, but I'm going to stay on that. Put words in your mouth because I wonder a little bit about your own pursuit here because of your own personal experience. And can you speak a little bit briefly about how that has impacted this? I mean, if somebody else was writing such a thesis, they might interview you. So how do you kind of incorporate your, or how do you handle that in terms of your assessment of the material, your construction of the arguments?
Again, so thank you for that question, Martin. For myself, when I started, again, I think when I started, I thought I knew where I was going with this, but I think it answers both parts of your question. I thought I was quite sure where it would go, and I was worried that my biases are not coming in my way, but I was surprised. But as I was doing this research, I think you're right in a sense. This was unknown for myself. Despite having that past experience, I realized how diverse refugee experiences are, even within Iranian refugee population, right? And I think to make it short, to summarize, I thought I knew where I was going with this. I thought it was clear for me, but then as I went to I was more involved in these interviews, I realized that I wasn't really sure. And I think I'm still in that phase. I'm trying still to figure out what I can learn from all of this and how I can relay that information with others.
Khan is next, and then Nicole.
Okay, hi Mehdi. Very interesting work. I really like what you have done so far. I have maybe two questions / observations. The first is that I like the fact that you decompose the concept of crisis, but I'm wondering if the very word of refugee needs some decomposition too. I was just looking at the dictionary of Cambridge, the Cambridge Dictionary and the Merriam-Webster. I think the definition given to refugee is pretty vague. For instance, one example is a person who flees to a foreign country or power to escape danger or persecution. But in your work, I also see that there are different motivations which justify their decision to leave the country, but mostly it's about war incurred or battle incurred reason. So I just wonder if you attempt to make further efforts in this direction is by just looking at war-related refugees or religious reasons and to narrow this term down as what you did with the term crisis. And the second question is about your case selection. I saw that in this presentation, all your analysis is based on 44 or anyway, less than 50 Syrian and Iranian refugees who lived now either in Lebanon, Germany, Turkey, Canada, etc. Is this the same sample for your PhD dissertation, or is just catered for this presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Chan. It's good to see you virtually. In terms of the definition, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's one of the things that stands out when you look at the responses to my questions, and you can see that the responses that I got do not necessarily match with the criteria set by UNHCR, for example, and the circumstances in which these people are, making these decisions, they don't necessarily they're really varied. They're really diverse in that sense. So so the notion of forced and voluntary migration, for example, that's a big question, right? So when somebody mentions that it's because of financial reasons or it's because of freedom or it's because of the social pressures in the country, then how do we define force in their forced migration, right? And can we disqualify them? Is it appropriate? And so many questions come in. Basically, briefly, I can say that I think that that's a fair point. And I think that's definitely one of the takeaways, that even the definition of refugee itself is not as clear in this case. And in terms of case selection, and this is for my, this is exactly the case selection for my dissertation, and this is a brief introduction into my dissertation. So 21 Syrians, 23 Syrians, Iranians, 21 Syrian, 23 Iranians.
Thank you. Shall we go to the swamp on the west coast? Nicole.
I was just going to make a remark that I'm coming to you from the swamp, which is a great metaphor for my workspace. Anyways, Mehdi, that was great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to flag that, and Oliver might know this. I can't remember who the person's name was, but maybe 5 years ago at CFGS, we had someone come and talk about specifically on the crisis narrative and the refugee crisis as it was happening. It was in the big boardroom. Oliver, I don't know if you remember that, but there was like a thing about the crisis, the like refugee crisis in the moment. And I can look back through my stuff, but as you were, I should have thought about this before. Anyways, my question is also kind of picking up on Martin's question about the title, but also kind of the broader kind of assumptions about the pursuit of the unknown related to refugees. And that is that like what I was hearing you say is that it is more about what they're fleeing. And so, and the definition, although I hope Rod is about to weigh in on this, but the definition in the International Convention is about fleeing away, not toward. And I'm wondering if like what is happening conceptually when you frame it as pursuit of the unknown, like as a going towards, as opposed to a fleeing from. And I can't believe I'm asking this kind of like conceptual of a question, because I usually like to say, so what's the policy going to be to fix this? But I think that there really is something to that also in terms of how people are perceiving what influences their decisions along the way. So I don't know if I even have a specific question, but just you know, this idea of going towards versus fleeing from, I think is really relevant to what you're looking at, and also to moments in a pathway or moments in a journey when decisions are being made to kind of keep moving forward, you know, this kind of, I don't know. Anyways, you don't need to answer that question, but that was just kind of one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking. But I think you're doing great work, and we chatted last week, but I feel like you're very far. It looks great, so well done.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I think the point you made helped me probably reflect more meaningfully on Martin's. I think I bettered Martin's question better, I guess. And to respond, well, I think it's a challenge. These are the conceptual components, the theoretical aspects of my work. These are work in progress. I'm still trying to figure out what all of this means. And again, I thought I knew. I was a refugee. I walked in their shoes. I knew what it felt. I thought I knew, at least. That's what I can say. But in terms of the term pursuit of the unknown, I think it has two. So being a refugee, and this is me just reflecting on the spot probably, because I wasn't thinking about the term this way. And as an ex-refugee, I feel like when you're talking about, when I'm saying pursuit of the unknown, there are two things happening. I think you cannot necessarily separate the force, the running away from and going to. So I think both elements might be involved. When it comes to that running away, that's something that you just have to do it. It's force. It's somebody's going to knock your door and they're going to arrest you and you don't know what is coming next, or a missile is going to hit your home because Assad is, bombarding the region. But also I think it has a second component, that you are, in a sense, trying to figure out, so what is next? So that the pursuit of the unknown is that what the figuring out of the next for a refugee, or for me at least, right? So you try to find your way, but what I can say is that I feel that both of them are involved. But why the term pursuit of the unknown in the title? Probably because it's a reflection of refugees within that situation, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I'm trying to figure it out myself.
No, I think that's great. And just going back to Oliver's original comment, is that what I think pursuit also does is it emphasizes the agency of refugees, whereas fleeing, I think, positions them more in the victim perspective. And I think pursuit is like a very active, somewhat strategic verb. And I like that kind of emphasizes or reinscribes their agency, because I think that is a huge problem in both the regime, but also the literature about agency of people on the move. So
one thing I want to add to that is that so that has only one caveat, or one thing to keep in mind, that when we're talking about agency, sometimes the emphasis on emphasis might refer to these people taking advantage of the system, right? So, or being upward. So I just want to say that these are having agencies is not necessarily that, and there is an element of force, right? So leaving their home is not their first option, but then when they're forced to leave their home, then that's the time that they are trying to figure out their way, and they're trying to move forward, basically.
yeah, I mean, we could go on. We could have a long conversation about agency and how it is both like useful and problematic in the space. But I think Rod's up, so I will.
Yep. Yeah. Indeed, Rod, please. You're still muted, Rod. Sorry.
Yes, sorry about that. No, I was going to raise precisely the same question. The pursuit toward, as distinct from or coupled with the flight from, and make the point about agency. The refugee is exercising agency in how to respond to circumstances that they don't control, but they're exercising agency within a lot of limitations, and they're exercising agency in the face of profound uncertainty. So you've got this notion of a need to exercise discretion, but in circumstances which really are far beyond control. So it's an interesting dilemma, and obviously there are aspects of both the flight and the pursuit. I just wanted to mention there's a book by a writer called Stephen Heighton. I don't know whether you know it, but it's called Reaching Methymna. And it's an account of his experience as a volunteer in Greece. And in the preamble to his book, he makes mention of the fact that the Greek word for refugee carries connotations more of movement toward than away. But it's an interesting book in itself. It's from the other side of your experience. It's the volunteer greeting the refugees, but it is an interesting book. And just to mention, you probably know it, but there's another novel that I found very interesting in picking up giving a little bit of insight into the life of a limited number of refugees. It's set in Germany. It's called Go, Went, Gone. I think Jenny Erpenbeek, I think it is. You may know it, Oliver, but it's a very interesting account. It would be sort of intriguing to some of the academics. It's cast from the voice of a retired academic in Germany discovering the fact of refugees. So worth recommending as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rod. I'm definitely going to look this up, and I'm sure they're going to be helpful. I really appreciate it.
Ted, I think you would like to come in.
Thank you, Oliver. Mehdi, wonderful, and the ensuing discussion certainly as well. And focusing on and comments that Rod made, and Nicole and others around, the terminology you started off with, this push versus pull, and I think it was a Rod, you mentioned flight versus pursuit, and coming from versus going to, as I think one term that Nicole used. And I'm wondering, in that context, throw in families into the discussion, either refugees that are leaving families behind, and or refugees that are traveling with families, or those that are trying to get to families in another country, and wondering to what extent you knew whether those 44 individuals were with families, and or to what extent families influence their decision making and in part influence their answers to your questions. Any thoughts?
I actually asked that question. Who did they leave with? And I need to look it up, but I asked that question, and some of them left with family. Some of them who were younger, basically they didn't have choice because the family decided they need to go to make certain decisions. With many of the Syrians, having a family member, a brother or father in Lebanon who was already working there was a motivator or motivation for going to Lebanon. For many of the Iranians who went to Turkey, for example, having family members who were already refugees there, or having connections to church or church members there was a significant factor. And some of them, so basically I have asked them that question. I have that data, but that's really messy because there is back and forth going on. Who went and they go, they come back, and then it's messy. But I have that. But I have that information, and family plays a role definitely in where they want to go, and in terms of who goes first as well. I don't know if I could answer your question, but I need to do a bit more digging in my data.
No, I was just curious of the context of the role that family played wherever they were remaining in the country under siege, if you will, or the refugees were trying to go to the country where other family members had already left and resided in or went with them. So, no, interesting. Thanks for that response.
Yeah, and something I can add is that Iranian and Syrian cultures are quite conservative. Probably Syrians are a bit more conservative than Iranian, and family is a big part. And And usually when family makes a decision, the children need to follow. So I had a lot of that, especially in the case of Syrians. I had a few examples that, for example, I had one female participant who decided to go back to Syria from Lebanon on her own to finish high school because education was the highest priority for her. And she convinced the family that she could go, even in conflict, in war, in that unsafe situation. So while most of the decisions were made by family, probably in some cases older brother or parents, but there are definitely some of the cases that children decided to do something. And on the other hand, like I had a couple cases who wanted to go from Lebanon to Europe on foot and water on the sea, but the family didn't give them permission. So, and they were adults. They were like 20, 21, but the family said you shouldn't go, and they didn't.
And just a real quick follow-up, it's not a question, just interesting you talk about education, and if refugees are, be they in transition or in the host country, I would imagine getting back into the educational loop is not a simple matter. So you can empathize a bit with that young lady that went back to Syria, I guess.
I definitely do, and that's one thing I could totally relate to. Myself, I had to leave my master's and go to Turkey unfinished. And I remember that the biggest fear I had, besides everything else, was that how can I go back to school? And one of the first days I came here, I went to political science department and I met with Andrew Wender. And I said, I want to come back. How can I do that? And it took 2 years for me to learn English, 2012 to 2014. But I can totally relate. It's a big concern, especially for younger generations. And it was brought up in many of the interviews by my Syrian participants.
Great, thanks. Your English is awesome, by the way, and thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. I look at the watch. We're going to come to the end very soon, but Mehdi, let me just reflect on 2 points or raise one question. One is, when we started off having the conversation about the design of your doctoral research, one thing that I wasn't quite clear about was your sense of what you're trying to do is to depict or even explain the behavior of refugees, right? And I wasn't quite sure what you actually meant. What exactly is the behavior? What decisions do you refer to? I think your presentation gave a much clearer sense of, what you actually describe, what you try to address in those interview questions, right? What their reasoning about taking certain steps, making decisions, right? So I think that really clarified quite a bit. The other, question that I have, and it refers to your title and how you pitched your talk today, was why is the term, the public debate about refugee crisis of such central importance for you? Because, you have a special slide even, how did the discourse, the sense of the refugee crisis impact what you did, right? I'm just wondering, why do you start with this question? You could frame it more broadly, right? How does the context of media, of public discourse, has an impact on the behavior of refugees? And then come to the finding that, the very talk of the refugee crisis has had an impact, right? But you start with your research question seems to be why the refugee crisis has an impact. I'm just wondering, why do you think it's so central to look at the term or the terminology of refugee crisis in this respect? I can see where you want to go, but I'm just wondering whether you could reflect on this a little bit. And then we're going to have a follow-up later on, the 2 of us, but maybe a short reflection on your focus on the terminology in the public debate on the refugee crisis.
I think that's that's really interesting you bring it up, because I think my answer to that question is that at this point I'm not sure, because I think what I have collected in my interviews is far beyond just the notion of refugee crisis. And I think the starting point was that it came sort of from a personal experience, being an Iranian refugee in 2011, 2012 in Turkey, and seeing the conflict is starting in Syria, more refugees coming. And as an Iranian refugee, I was worried that what would it mean for me, because we are not getting the spotlight. And what would it mean for our future? What would it mean for my resettlement and all that? So I think that was the starting point. That I think that question was in my mind, not as an academic, but probably as a refugee. And then that's what I brought into my research. But now that I'm reflecting, I think. Removing that centrality from refugee crisis, I don't think is going to change my research. I think that's at least the least I can say.
Yeah, I totally agree, right? It is a lens into how, the debate, policy formation, all this has an impact on, steering behavior, and, in a way it has a feedback that, and then also maybe unintended consequences that we are not aware of, right? Remember when Justin Trudeau said Canada is open to refugees, talking about the situation on the southern border, right? And then, it basically was transported into all kinds of areas of Latin America. And so Trudeau had to walk this back very quickly, because, these public debates have effects on the ground. I think that's fascinating. And crisis is just, the depiction of crisis is only one element of this, but I can definitely see how over the years, in particular, during this dramatic time frame in 15, 16, it shaped things on the ground.